Muted. There you go.
And you would think that I would know this by now. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Cannabis Oversight Committee meeting. I was so excited to get started that I was speaking for a couple of seconds on mute. With that, the meeting will begin now. It will be recorded, as are all meetings, and the recording will be posted a couple of days after today's meeting to the website. Just want to remind everyone that anything that is said today will be recorded, and there will be an opportunity for public comment, both specific and general public comment, towards the end of the meeting. Also, just a heads up for anyone who is interested in hearing some updates about staffing within the OOC, please wait until the end of the meeting. The OOC will be providing some general announcements then. With that, I kick it over to Chair Jamalian so we can begin.
Thank you, Nikesh. Welcome, Cannabis Oversight Committee members, general public, and the COC and the OOC. Before we get started with today's meeting, I usually have some opening remarks, but we got two major points to work off, so there's no opening remarks today. Regarding public comment from members of the public, as you all know, please note that you all have an opportunity to speak to every agenda item specifically in the public comment section. You can dial in by phone or use the Cisco WebEx system to make your comment. Please do note that the committee members won't respond to you directly, and to keep your comments specific to the agenda item. There will be a general public comment section at the very end of the meeting where you can make general comments regarding anything you want to say for the industry. So that being said, I will move on to agenda item number 1. Can we do a roll call, David?
Yes. We will begin right now with non-voting members of the committee. Seat 1, Mohanan Mali. Okay, absent. Seat 2 is representatives from the SF Police Department. Do we have either Captain Brian Philpott or Sergeant Chris Oshida? C3, Department of Building Inspection, Jeff Buckley.
Present.
Present. Great, thank you. C4 from the Planning Department, Michael Christensen.
Present.
Okay. C5, San Francisco Unified, Corey Pak.
Present.
C6 from the Entertainment Commission, either Maggie Weiland, Caitlin Azevedo, or Dylan Rice.
David, I was informed by Dylan that he will not be able to attend. He's also not feeling well.
Okay, thanks, Nikesh. Seat 7, SF Fire Department. We have either Lieutenant Rick Fugari, Lieutenant Dennis Sai, or any other representatives.
Fire's here.
Okay, and Lieutenant Sai, thank you. Our voting members, seat 8, Chair Ali Jamalian.
Present.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Present.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Present. Present.
Seat 11, Doug Block. Did not see Doug's. Seat 12, Sean Richard. I don't have Sean. Sheet 13, Nina Parks.
Present.
Seat 14, Brendan Holland.
Present.
Seat 15, Teresa Foglio Ramirez.
Present.
And seat 16, Sarah Payne. Okay, so with that, we have enough members to make a quorum with 3 members absent at the moment.
Thank you, David. That closes agenda item number 1, and we'll move on to number 2, which we do every time. It's the adoption of the resolution of having a virtual meeting. David, if you don't mind sharing your screen, I really don't think we need too much time to vote on this. So if you don't mind sharing your screen, and then Ray, if you can instruct the general public how to make a comment on the agenda item.
Yes, I just, if the Office of Cannabis could give me permission to share. Oh, there it is.
Yes.
Great.
You're now a presenter.
Appreciate it, Jeremy. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Ray, if you don't mind giving instructions on public comment while we scroll through this wonderful work of literature here.
Sure, and I'll be pinch hitting for Ray today. Jeremy Schwartz here. Regarding public comment for members of the public, please note that you have two options to provide public comment at this time. The first option is to call in by phone. If you would like to use this option, please dial 1-415-655-0001, followed by this access code 2489-809-0520, followed by *3 when prompted to do so. Regarding option 2, I will soon open up the chat box, and if you would like, you're able to submit your comment via the chat box, and we'll review them in the order received.
David, it may also help just to share your screen with the agenda and the public comment instructions, just for folks who may have missed it or not caught it.
Do we have any public comments?
At this time, there are no public comments in the chat, and I will check for the phone queue, and we do not have any callers at this time.
Is there a motion to approve the resolution from a committee member?
So moved. Second. Nina Parks.
Thank you. Can we get a vote, David?
Yes. Let me. Okay, seat 8, Ali.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron.
Aye.
Seat 10, Brian McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 13, Nina Parks.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Aye.
Seat 15, Teresa.
Aye.
And the motion passes with 6 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you, David. Agenda item number 2 is now closed. Moving on to agenda item number 3, where we will most likely have a little change. Please take a minute to review today's agenda and make any amendments, I think in this case, to cater to one of our fellow committee members. So please review the agenda. We will then open up for public comment. And Jeremy, if you don't mind, in the meantime, instructing the public again, that would be great.
Absolutely, Chair Jamalian. Again, public comment is now open. The first option, one of two, is to call in by phone. If you would like to use this option, dial 1-415-655-0001, followed by the access code 2489-809-0520, followed by *3. The second option to provide public comment is via the chat box. Again, limited to this agenda item. If you would like, you're welcome to submit your comment through the chat box, and we'll allow folks to go in the order received.
Thank you, Jeremy. And are there any modifications that we want to make? I believe there was moving point 6 to 0.5, switching those two around because I believe Jeff has a commitment and a hard stop at 3.
Chair Jamalian, I may have just missed this, but is the public comment still open?
Yes, it's open. I just wanted to make sure the public knows what they're commenting on.
Perfect.
Do we have any public comments?
We do not via the chat box, and I will check the call list. And then one question for Nikesh, whether the exclamation mark next to an individual indicates that they'd like to speak.
That is a good question. Typically, when someone wants to speak, their hand is raised. So the exclamation point may be referring to something else.
Okay.
I would just take the hand raised as a signal that they're in the queue for a call.
Okay. I see. So with that being said, it doesn't look like there are public comments via the call log or the chat box.
Thank you, Jeremy. Is there a motion to switch agenda points? 5 and 6.
I'll make a motion to switch agenda points 5 and 6.
Thank you. Motion on the floor. Anybody second that?
All right, who just seconded it?
Teresa Foglio Ramirez.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you,
Okay.
Teresa. We get a vote. David?
Yes. Seat 8, Chair Jamalian.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 13, Nina Parks.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Aye.
Seat 15, Teresa Foglio Ramirez.
Aye.
Okay, and with that, the motion passes with 6 yeas and 0 nays.
Thank you, David. That closes this agenda item, and we're switching agenda item 5 and 6 around. Now moving on to agenda item number 4, review of the last meeting minutes. Please take a minute. If you could throw those up on the screen as well. We could take a few minutes to review them, and then take public comment before we vote on adapting or make any comments for changing or editing it if you find anything inaccurate.
Chair Jamalian, just looking at the agenda, I noticed that it's 2 sets of meeting minutes, the last meeting minutes as well as the one from November 2021, and specifically section 5. The question that I would propose to you though is there a quorum if the 4 members who recuse themselves for the grants conversation would need to be absent from voting on approving that section for this meeting? And I suspect the answer to that is yes, but just wanted to flag that. It may become a moot point right now.
Yeah, almost seems like we should have addressed that in the last agenda. When we were altering the agenda, we could have taken out the minutes from the. You're referring to the February meeting, correct?
Well, and let me correct myself a little bit. So here, for this item, both sets of minutes can be approved. However, the meeting minutes from the November meeting, there's only one section that needs to be approved, and it needs to be approved by the 5 members who were present who did not recuse themselves from that conversation. I think the issue today is that if the 4 members who recused themselves, and I believe they were you, Member Parks, Member Hallinan, and Member Richards, then there wouldn't be quorum to vote on that minute anyway. So where I'm going with this is I don't think that the November 17 minutes can actually be approved at this meeting specifically Section 5, because there aren't enough members to constitute quorum after you recuse those who wouldn't be able to participate in that vote.
Agreed. So we need a motion to just adopt the February 16th ones.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Then we should give the public instructions on how to comment and take public comment before we would put that up for a vote.
Absolutely. Regarding public comment for members of the public, as a reminder, there are two options to provide your comment. The first option is to call in by phone. If you would like to use this option, please dial 1-415-655-0001, followed by the access code 2489-809-0520, followed by *3 when prompted to do so. Additionally, there's a second option to submit public comment via the chat box. The chat box is now open, and I will read comments as they come in.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any comments in the chat box or via phone?
At this time, there are no comments being suggested through the call log. As far as the chat box, there are no public comments in that queue either. At this time, no public comment.
Thank you, Jeremy. Do we have a motion? Do we have any edits or alterations? Does anybody see anything that needs to be edited or altered first? And if not, can we get a motion to approve the February 16th minutes? Looks like there's no edits, so we can
Brendan
start.
Hallinan, motion to approve.
Thank you, Brendan.
Second, Aaron Flynn.
Thank you, Aaron. Can we get a vote, David?
Yes. Seat 8, Chair Jamali.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 13, Nina Parks.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Aye.
Seat 15, Teresa Foglio Ramirez.
Abstain, wasn't present.
And with that, the motion passes with 5 yeas and 1 abstention.
Thank you, David. That concludes agenda item number 4, and we can move on to agenda item number 5, formerly known as 6, permit processing within the Department of Building Inspection. And the reason this agenda item came up and why Jeff Buckley is kind enough to kind of give us a small overview of the process of DBI is because we, in the community, I think there's quite a bit of ambiguity about the DBI process. And at one point, we were given a contact person, I believe his name was Mr. Hernandez, who was supposed to kind of function as a social equity point of contact. And that just sort of trickled away, and now there is no more contact at DBI. So Jeff was kind enough to volunteer a presentation that first of all outlines the process that you have to go through at DBI, plan, check, intake, etc. I think that gives people a better view of the duration of this process. And then there's obviously some code compliance things that will be specific to whether you're cultivating or manufacturing. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of information about that as well. So with that being said, I would like to pass it on to Jeff Buckley, our committee member representing DBI. Floor is yours, Jeff.
Thank you, Chair Jamali, and I appreciate it. And committee members, nice to meet you. Jeff Buckley, Policy and Public Affairs Director at the Department of Building Inspection. So I was going to touch briefly on both our process, but through the course of the review of our data, I also wanted to kind of present, based on the permits that have come through the door, like what we've learned from those permits, what trends we're seeing, and to give you kind of a breakdown a little bit about where we think at DBI, where there might be some gaps or areas of improvement. I thought maybe that would be, I think, a way to frame the conversation so we can kind of ground it in the actual work that's being done. And so through the course of that, I'm happy to discuss anything related to like our over-the-counter process or our in-house review process. I will refer to forms that we use. Some of you may know those forms, others may not. So I'm going to also just reference them in relation to kind of the common terms that are related to them, which is over-the-counter permits or to in-house review. So what we did was we worked with the Office of Cannabis, and they provided us with 23 establishments that have permits that we wanted to review and investigate. So the overwhelming majority of those permits we reviewed were retail operators, but through the course and the input of the Office of Cannabis, we did add 3 supply chain operators as well that are permitted and possess Article 16 permits, because we wanted to kind of give you a full picture of the average processing time for all Article 16 permittees who went through the city's permitting process. And so again, we were provided and worked through a list of 23 establishments that we investigated. 2 of those did not have the evidence of permit history for cannabis operation. And through the course of it, there were 55 permit addenda that were pulled to examine. And so some were full permits for the change of use or tenant improvement, and others were things like signage or other renovations. And just for your reference, street use permits were excluded. So in terms of the permit breakdown, we had 32 of those permits were what we at DBI call Form 8s, but those are your over-the-counter permits. And so again, I don't mean to be pedantic for those of you who are very familiar with our process, but over-the-counter permit, think of it as you're the person, you or your agent or representative is the one who controls your plans if you need to submit plans. And so you're moving through the station over at our permit center in control of those permits. You go from station to station depending on what needs that you have, whether you need to get planning department approval, whether there's a structural component to the plans. So it really does depend. It's a little site specific. But in general, the applicant is in control, moving around, and ultimately may be able to get the approvals that day, or may receive comments that they then have to respond back to, depending on what's submitted in the plans. As a rule of thumb, our rule of thumb is to be able to provide over-the-counter service within 2 days, and to have 60% of our applicants who are using the over-the-counter process be able to receive their approvals within a 2-day period. And the reason we called a 2-day period is just in case you need to come back and make a payment on the second day, which is something that we find customary. And then, so 32 of those were our over-the-counter permits. And then 13 were what we call Form 3, but what you would probably call an alteration or repairs permit. And so those are different. Those are permits that require in-house review. And so when a permit goes in for in-house review, they're analyzed the plans are analyzed by one of our engineering team, depending on whether there's ventilation or mechanical requirements, depending on whether there's a structural component to the work being done. And so those permits take longer. They tend to be permits that get reviewed. And depending on the back and forth that happens between the applicant and the city's permitting departments, that can take a decent amount of time. And so I want to just make sure that we're aware the majority of the permits so far that we've seen are over-the-counter permits, but there are 13 of those permits that were alteration and repairs. In addition to that, 9 of the permits that we looked at were what we call Form 4 or 7s, and those are signed permits. And then 1 was an addenda. And so of those permits, we had 7 of the permits have not yet been issued. And so they're currently going through the process. 66% of our over-the-counter permits were issued in less than 30 business days. So 20 permits took longer than 30 days to issue. So those are about half of, and about half of those spent about a third of their total time or more of their issuance time with the planning department. And presumably due to conditional use changes or permits that planning is required to do that were likely set forward in enabling ordinances by the Board of Supervisors. And so others appear to have longer holds due to needing responses or new plans from the customers. And some have a 90-day recheck mentioned after all stations have finished review. We're not sure why this is necessary, and that's going to be something that we kind of look into based, on our review of this information and being asked by you to be able to provide. So some of our thoughts. So I think for one, some permits appear to have done most of their work with planning prior to applying for a building permit. And this seems to be important for a smoother process for the applicants who chose to submit in that way. And there can be delays also based on needing revisions or responses from the customer. That is, typical here within DBI is the back and forth between the applicant and the city's permitting divisions. And so any, if you are an applicant and your agent is down there trying your best to kind of be on top of what your architect is being told, so that you can also make sure that those comments are being, addressed and then resubmitted in a reasonable amount of time. Don't just assume because the architect, has a license that they're going to be able to do it, in the first time. I think there are times where there is a back and forth that goes on between the reviewer and the architect. And as the applicant, I think it's really important to kind of stay on top of that. And so another thing we realized is that for our electronic plan review can really be used to improve and really eliminate the delays that occur, not only the handoffs between departments, but also I think the back and forth that exists between the customer and the permitting departments. And so just to highlight for people, anything that's in-house can use the electronic plan review process. So that's something that you can choose and elect to do if you want to. And we would encourage you to do it because I think what we've seen just from a review of the data, there are shorter timelines between the applicant and the permitting departments if they use EPR versus those that use kind of more of a paper form of application. And just so you know, in March, so last month, 67% of our in-house review permits were filed with electronic plan review. And I'll follow up in a second on this because I think there's additional steps we could take as a department to help your applicants be able to become familiar with what we call EPR and hopefully utilize it more frequently. And then our Form 8 or permits or over-the-counter permits are generally reviewed in person, and the customer is responsible for walking into each of the stations to meet with the plan checker, as I mentioned before. So if the customer leaves and comes back many days later, the days to issue will be longer. And so that's representative in a lot of ways of our sample size for the amount of time that the OTC permits are taking, is the kind of response between the city and then also for the applicant to get back to the city, to whichever department basically issued the comments. And then lastly, COVID, I think we all should acknowledge that COVID disruptions to OTC review no doubt significantly impacted the timelines of our performance of these type of permits. But we think that that disruption is in the past. We're now back to full in-person service. So we feel like we're capable of being able to manage the workload that's coming through. And I know people experience some, major changes to the way that we review those permits during the, the health order that was issued. And so obviously we, that's a lot of it was beyond our control, but when it was, I think it impacted our service levels. But I think we're back to in-person service now, and our service performance indicators are indicating that our numbers are up in terms of both the submittals, but also the turnaround time that's necessary for those permits. So I know I threw a lot at you, so I just wanted to reserve some time for comment and to discuss anything related to those issues. As for the code enforcement process, we did not pull that data in advance, but I would be happy to do that after this meeting, and either through the committee staff or through Chair Jamali, and get back to you with that information in a certain similar effort in terms of both reviewing the data and then also drawing a certain amount of conclusions from our end about how both we can improve service and then also we can make recommendations for you. The last thing I'll say is that for EPR, to encourage more EPR, we could work with staff maybe to come up with some tutorials, workshops, things like that we could use to kind of make this process more familiar with applicants. And then frankly, if there's any other gaps in terms of how we can better educate our customers about what the process is, I'm happy to take that feedback and work with either staff or committee members to improve performance.
Thank you, Jeff. That was all very, very helpful and insightful. I think we are going to open up for discussion. I'm sure all of my committee fellow members have questions to ask. I understand the OTC part takes 48 hours. And when you're talking about the Form 3, and you said that could take a decent amount of time, can we get something a little bit more defined than that as a decent amount of time? 4 weeks, 12 weeks, or can it get stuck at a certain desk for 8 weeks? I mean, often it happens you make it through a certain number of plan checks pretty smoothly, and then you see it online, to your point, where we can track the permit. You see it get stuck for weeks at a time, and then you see the review takes 10 minutes and it's passed. So is that a backlog on that particular station? Is there a way to kind of work the other stations in the meantime? That would be kind of my question. And this is obviously not, to your point, it doesn't apply to OTC because you're in charge of your plans with an OTC. But we're not when we go into a full review. And I think that also affects mostly supply chain operators. Is that correct?
It can affect supply chain operators, but I think it can also affect retail operators who are doing significant improvements within their properties. It really depends on what work is being done. So yeah, I mean, the difficulties of, as a reminder, so of the 55 permits, there are 23 establishments, 55 permits. 13 of the permits, the overall 55, were for what we call in-house review. So it is a relative subset of that number. And so it was difficult for us to draw a conclusion about timeline because of, I think, the length of time we were seeing and the differences between both the performance under EPR, the electronic plan review, and those that were doing paper applications. I could come back to you with more information about the in-house review in terms of that breakdown, like how quickly it took for the EPR applicants versus the paper applicants, and kind of drill down more into that information. But I think there's a combination of different things that go on. I think the first is there are times, you know, the plan reviewer for all stations is not necessarily going to act on that permit once that permit comes into that station. And so there are just built into the system certain times that it should take for that person to be able to get to respond to you know, the plans that are before them. That can vary by station, but I think typically we want to be able to provide review of those. We want those to be able to get in and out of a station typically within 2 to 3 weeks after arrival. During high periods, it can be as long as a month, and that's really for DBI. For other stations, it's less clear what's happening there. So to answer your question about the time, there is definitely built into the system a certain delay time based on just the volume that the plan reviewer is seeing, which is why we would recommend EPR as a bit of a solution there, because what happens is, for those who haven't experienced it, is that there's a time that's clocked for somebody to be able to present their plan. So your architect is there. Think of it as like a virtual roundtable with the various permitting departments. And so they're basically reviewing it. They will review and then provide those comments. Not always at the same time, but certainly with less sequential delays than what you see with the paper application. So it's kind of the wave of it is the future. The future is now, and we're trying to get more people to use it because we think it's more useful for applicants, and cuts down on some of the kind of back and forth between the applicant and the city permitting divisions, and then also cuts down on the delay time between routing from one station to the next.
And can any scope of work be submitted via the EPR, or does it have to be a certain type of? Because I know that, and I've heard a lot when they ask for wet signatures, which also costs the applicant like a $600 print job every time they ask for a new wet signature. But can you just submit any scope, any kind of work, any building permit via the EPR?
So it's my understanding the wet signature is a requirement by code. So that is unfortunately not something that we can change without adopting a new code that allows for more of electronic or some other form of signature. Anecdotally, I learned that just by asking a question about it, because I had somebody else similarly asking me, like, why do I need a wet signature? And I was like, great question. So then I went and found it out that it's actually it's a code requirement.
So it's submitted digitally, and it still has to be submitted at DBI in paper, but you pick which route it's processed. Is that correct?
Well, it does kind of get spit out as a PDF, as a fillable PDF that does eventually require a wet signature. But by using the EPR route, you're able to basically cut down, as I mentioned, on like people are providing their comments somewhat simultaneous to each other. So you don't have to deal with that kind of like station to station review process. If that's helpful.
It's a collaborative tool for DBI plan checkers, basically, to get or to route it electronically and have the plan checkers be able to collaborate on that particular plan without having to walk to each other's desks.
So Chair Jamali, you're correct about that, but it's also other departments. So both fire, planning, if they have comments, DPW, if there were ever need for a DPW permit review, all of them have access to the EPR, and they all submit their comments somewhat simultaneously after a session has been established, where the plans are reviewed. And yeah, I would love to get to a point where it's all done electronically without any type of paper approval, but I think we're in a bit of an iterative process. And then also because of certain code requirements, the wet signature being one of them, we have to be able to have some form of a document to be able to apply that signature to.
Thank you so much, Jeff. This is all really helpful, and I don't want to hog all the time, so please, fellow committee members, floor is yours.
This is Brendan. I have a quick question. Hi, Jeff.
Brendan, good to see you.
Yeah, I'm hiding today because I'm a little under the weather. I'm not looking at my best, so this is a good opportunity to talk to you about this, because I think Michael Christensen's also on, and this kind of has to do a little bit with the interplay of this EPR with planning as well. So I know that there's a pretty significant backup to get assigned a plan checker right now for projects. And so I'm wondering about if you can file your building permit application through the EPR process. And is there also a tool to submit a conditional use application or conditional use authorization application through EPR, or would that be submitted separately through planning, or a way to kind of get the get time working in your favor with planning simultaneously while you're waiting for your building permit to be routed around the various departments?
So there's a couple different questions in there, Brendan. So let me take a couple of them, and I'll definitely punt, in terms of the conditional use application process. It's my understanding that's not handled electronically or through EPR, but Michael can confirm that or add any additional information as it relates to it. So one of the interesting things about reviewing the data is I had an assumption that if you were to submit your application simultaneously or somewhere around the time as you were seeking your planning approval, that you would have that it would kind of run through the process, and then when your planning authorization was then granted, your building permit would be there kind of ready to go. And I guess what I would say is that's not really been the case from what we've seen of the permits that were submitted. So permit applicants who appear to have done most of their work with planning prior to applying for the permits seem to have a smoother process advancing through. Now, it could be a couple ways. I was reflecting on that and asking questions about it. I think one of them may just be that at the end of the day, if a staff member sees that a permit has filed for conditional use, think about just the idea that we have to do work that's billable. And then if that authorization for whatever reason isn't granted, the department, ultimately has done a lot of work without payment, and ultimately there's no guarantee that that work would be done, and that the planning entitlement would be granted. So that could be one of the reasons why we're seeing that the simultaneous submittals may not always be the best route, and that the submittal after the planning department approval has done, it seems like that's a far more logical and smooth process, because then you're not kind of playing three-dimensional chess, both whatever you need to do to be able to get the planning approval, working the planning approval process itself, and then also working with the various counter reviewers within the departments. It seems like that's a process that is difficult for a lot of operators, and what we're seeing from the permits that were submitted is not necessarily the most efficient way. So it kind of challenges that assumption that I frankly had prior to looking at the data and reviewing it. But as for the conditional use submittal, I'll defer to planning on that.
Good afternoon, committee members. Michael Christensen, permit center staff, but operating for the planning department. The planning department does not accept any applications in paper. All of our applications are required to be submitted electronically. To Jeff's point, if you require conditional use, you kind of have this two-step process where you have to get conditional use before you can get a building permit. Like I said, our process is fully digital. We have a web portal where you submit the application. We don't want your paper. If you give us your paper, we're gonna throw it in a recycling bin. So we are 100% electronic. The city has an established policy that permits are reviewed by the planning department first. So in the paper process, they come to us first before they go to other stations. In electronic plan review, the permits come to us and need to be approved by us before they are opened up to other agencies for review. It's exactly what Jeff said. If there's still a question of whether the planning department will approve a permit, then the city generally just doesn't want to open it up for those other stations, because if that is denied, then it's a cost to the city and a cost to the applicant that is not recoverable. Planning is somewhat unique in that we are the only review station that you could fully meet our code and we can still deny your project if you don't meet subjective findings for approval. So there is a big question when you come to us about, are you going to get approved in the first place? You can meet the 600-foot rule, you can meet the planning code, we can still deny your project. And so until that question of whether the project is approved in the first place is resolved, the city does not open you up for review by the other permitting agencies.
Okay, that makes sense. So you wouldn't need I think when I think of the process, I think of kind of like traditionally that a building permit application would be submitted and a number assigned, and then planning would be kind of the first review. But according to from what I'm understanding, that you could just submit directly to planning without having to submit a building permit application first to kind of like you know, attach that conditional use authorization application to identify it.
That's correct. If you have a
Okay.
project that is principally permitted, then your first step is to apply for a building permit. If you have a project that requires any type of planning department entitlement, conditional use, variance, whatever it is, you can, and we encourage you to first apply for that entitlement and resolve that entitlement question, and then apply for your building permit. If you do that, then we may be able to have planning just immediately approve your building permit based off your prior entitlement, and you just go directly to being reviewed by every other agency. So you avoid it sitting and kind of waiting to resolve the issue of the entitlement.
I think that would be, I know, Jeff, that you kind of mentioned maybe, in terms of like the electronic plan review overview for applicants. I think that what Michael just described, that process, I think would be very helpful for applicants to understand that. I think maybe architects may understand that, or expediters, but I think when a lot of the time when you have an equity applicant who's looking at taking on a CUA project, it's pretty daunting. And so to know that they could do that kind of directly, like right away, I think is very informative. And I think that could be something that would, if we could create some sort of flow chart that includes that, I think that would be helpful for a lot of applicants. And they're budgeting out their timeline and everything, not wasting time by doing it backwards, which I think would lead to a big waste of time if you did it backwards, right?
Okay. It's a good idea. I'll definitely take a note of it.
But to go to your point of architect, Brendan, you still need a full permit set to go to planning, correct?
I think you just need a site plan, but I'll defer to Michael on that.
For a planning department entitlement, you need a set of plans that meets our plan submittal guidelines,
Mhm.
which is site plan, floor plans, elevation drawings. If you're doing construction, there's some other detail that we need, but it is not the full set that you need to apply for a building permit. It's a reduced scope because it's conceptual.
Okay. It would also be great to have that as part of that flow chart, because it's obviously, if we're not sure about it, then we can assume the general public also has a hard time figuring that one out. And then that process, Michael, how long does that take? And I know that right now there's a particular backlog, but generally, how long does that process take for you guys from intake to, because I still believe if you're retail, having the hearing would be part of that, correct? Part of the approval process?
So if you have a project that is subject to conditional use authorization, there's a couple avenues that you can avail yourself to. We have begun to allow retail projects to use CB3P, the Community Business Priority Processing Program. If you file under CB3P, you are guaranteed to have a hearing date within 90 days, but that doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to have an approval at that hearing. So if your case is still controversial, there's neighborhood opposition, it doesn't remove that element of the review, but it can get you to a hearing faster. Currently, the planning department is experiencing staffing difficulties. We are anticipating having someone new to manage our cannabis programs in the next few months that would specifically work on these projects and not have other cases in their backlog, which would really help us. But that needs to get through the city hiring process to be available. Currently, general projects have about a 12-week backlog just to be assigned a planner.
Which would be 12 weeks plus, then in the best case, 90 days, correct?
If you file under CB3P, it's 90 days from the date of receipt of a complete application.
Okay. All right. That's That's pretty standard. I think that's what most of us went through, about 60 to 90 days, right? Thank you for that information. That's really helpful. And maybe in the next Office of Cannabis bulletin, we can share a link to the CBPPP. That would probably be also helpful. I think most of us don't know how to find that. So maybe we can guide some of our community members to explore that route.
Happy to include it.
Chair Jamalian, if there aren't any other questions, there is something that I would like to bring up, and it really pertains to kind of DBI, fire, and planning. It's a specific issue that pre-existing cultivators and cultivators in the city have been dealing with and are looking at as they look to get their permanent licenses. And I was thinking about maybe adding it in on the agenda, but then I saw this as an agenda item, so thought this would be a good place to discuss it. It's a little specific, so I just wanted to make sure that I gave everybody else a chance to kind of wrap this conversation up, but just wanted to make sure there was maybe a little bit of time for me to put this forward.
Yes, please, Aaron. That's very much welcomed. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, like I said, this pertains really to DBI planning and fire, and I know that we have Lieutenant Sy on the call as well, and appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody in one sitting. Essentially, in 2018, the fire department decided that they wanted all cultivators to change their occupancy code to an F1 occupancy if they weren't already designated F1. And we've been doing a little bit of informal polling over the last 5 or 6 months, and we've all recognized that the fire department has been out doing some life safety inspections, kind of checking back in on folks as everybody is looking to remediate all of their old notices of violation from 2018 so that they can get their annual permits. And what we're finding is that from the polling, most cultivators in the city are really having a hard time changing their occupancy code to F1 from whatever their other occupancy code was. As we look a little bit deeper into it, we find that F1 is a really heavy manufacturing occupancy, and many of these buildings, especially if they're 2 floors or different things of that nature, would require significant seismic and structural upgrades in order to meet that F1 zoning designation. And so many, if not most, cultivators in the city, this is pretty much the last notice of violation that they have from 2018, is this change to the F1 occupancy code. And for many of them, doing so is going to be a significant financial hardship. And in some cases, it's simply not possible in the buildings that they're in. And so what we are hoping to open up is a discussion around the F1 designation, if there might be the opportunity for that designation, that occupancy code to be rethought, or if there is an opportunity for operators on a specific level to either apply for a hardship or to simply, have a structural engineer look at their project specifically and stamp the fact that, they have plants on a second floor. It does not need to have the load rating that F1 would require. And from what we can tell, this is something that would block roughly 75+% of the existing cultivators from getting their last NOVs signed off on, and possibly cause a lot of issues with them getting their final permits. So I know this is really specific again, but I just wanted to open up the discussion and see, maybe in a future meeting, if we could get some information both from fire and planning on how many cultivators have actually been able to change their occupancy code to F1, how many still have this as an outstanding notice of violation, and then from fire, could there be a conversation around looking at some different occupancy codes that could be included in cultivation as an activity, and or creating some type of exemption or hardship so that operators aren't going to be held up with this issue? So I'm sorry, I didn't even necessarily direct that at anyone in particular. Just wanted to get that note down with planning and fire. I don't know if Michael, you might have anything, or Lieutenant Sai, you guys might have any insight on this issue. I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot. This might be the first time this is getting brought up in a while.
This is Lieutenant Sai of San Francisco Fire Department. Thank you for the question. So, from my understanding, this was from the International Fire Code. That's where this was adopted, and the state fire marshal adopted. So, I don't believe it was something local that was decided. This was something that was this came from the state level. So, I wouldn't have any say on changing that or how we'd go about that. I'm sure it'd be a little bit of a long process, probably a longer discussion than we would be able to have here. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has any comment on that.
This is Michael Christensen on behalf of City Planning. Just to be clear, the Planning Department does not review or approve occupancy codes. It's something maintained by the Department of Building Inspection and the Fire Department. So not something that I can comment on.
I could come back to you, or we could agendize it at a future discussion, and so I can make sure that the people who are here within the department who are knowledgeable can present or have that discussion with you.
Yeah, and to Lieutenant Sai's point, if it's a state issue, it kind of becomes a moot point here. But Aaron, did you get any guidance on what would be a possible occupancy classification that we would get behind, or that would enable these 75% of our local growers to successfully transition?
I think we would need to see a couple of other occupancy codes included, such as like a B occupancy code, which is, I believe, office space, and one or two other occupancy codes that are still kind of, heavy commercial, but not just F1. And then question for Lieutenant Sai, or comment, I guess, it's from what we can understand, it was Captain Mary C, who back in 2018 there was actually some ambiguity around whether or not F1 or one other occupancy code was going to be applied to cultivation. So if it was the fire department just looking at kind of guidance from the state, what would be the best way for operators to engage to try to get some clarity on whether or not this was, the city taking state guidance and then issuing these notices of violation, basically saying you're not F1, and in order to clear your notice of violation, you have to change your occupancy to F1, because that was a local permit violation that was given by SFFD. So just trying to maybe identify the right channels with which operators can go to try to plead their case.
So a little history on that. So back in 2018, Captain Shea was involved with the inspections. So typically buildings have to be classified under a certain occupancy, just like there's zoning for certain areas. You don't see high rises in residential areas and vice versa. Same kind of idea. Back in 2018, when this program was just beginning, I was not involved. My understanding was then this was all kind of coming to light. All the agencies were trying to legalize and get everybody up to code, get everything safe. At that time, we were using occupancy of what was a group U. And the idea was the things that fall under that, for example, are different things like barns, carports, shed, stables. But the key there was agriculture buildings. I believe that was why U was being used. Fast forward to 2021 or so, maybe around there. DBI might know the exact date. It was determined that F1 was more accurate because of the hazard load for what was being the type of operation or type of work that was going to be done in the building. So in an F1 occupancy, there's two. There's F1 and F2. Low hazards are F2, F1s are high hazard. The reason they fall into that is it kind of falls under tobacco. It's the material basically. So like, for example, I'll give you a list of F2 and maybe it'll make more sense. So in F2 occupancies, in the California Fire Code, beverages, brick and masonry, ceramic products, foundries, glass products, gypsum, ice, metal products. As you can see, those are very non-combustible items. When you get into an F1 classification, it's more of a moderate hazard, industrial use type of occupancy. So there's where you're going to kind of see more like business machines, construction, agricultural machinery, tobacco, textiles, wood distillation, woodworking, et cetera, et cetera. There's a number of things that kind of fall under the F1. So it was determined based on the code that the F1 seemed to be more appropriate for that type of use that was going on. So they changed it. So when operators back in 2018, when they were able to do the change of use and go to the U, we had no problem. Fast forward to like today. Like if you did the U, we leave you alone and we move on. You've completed your change of occupancy. However, if there was nothing done, then by today's code, you have to be in F1. And so we are just enforcing the California State Fire Code. It wasn't so much our decision. It was just that that's how the progression works. So like the International Fire Code comes out, they do their own rules. The state takes a look at it. They may change or add things. They cannot be less restrictive. As it goes down the line, agencies can be more restrictive or just adapt exactly word for word verbatim. So as it comes down, San Francisco local code, is the final, and we just adopt the state fire code. And so that's why the F1 is where we're at today. This isn't something that we kind of looked at and decided, okay, well, this is more appropriate. This is all at the state level. And so that might be why back in 2018, the U occupancy was what we were requesting. As time changed and it advanced, we realized, or actually the state, I should say, realized that the F1 was more appropriate. And we issued the violations at the time to kind of push towards changing whatever it is that, whatever classification they were, if they were a B or an S, whatever, to a U or an F1, today. There was also, if you take a look at some of the operators, other violations, if they were using CO2, for example, for extraction, that was something that needed to be permitted and approved through DVI plans and everything. And then more on a local level with the business, if the business didn't have emergency lights, exit signs, just life safety issues. If there was a fire alarm, if there was a sprinkler, were they certified, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all things that we enforce all through the California California Fire Code. So I hope that answers why the difference in occupancy code, 2018 versus today.
Very, very helpful and good in-depth information. Thank you. I think that the primary issue remains that there was the U versus F1 kind of debate that was going on in 2018, but from what we can gather, every cultivator in the city was told there was no option U or F1. They all received notices of violation saying change your use to F1. And the larger issue is, I won't go too far down the road of, I mean, when you laid out the difference between F1 and F2, I think is very clear when we're talking about cultivation, which is simply plants on trays being watered, it is not heavy machinery, it is not heavy equipment. It falls well into the F2 designation. And the reason that the F1 designation is so hard for many of these cultivators or many of these operators to comply with is because it requires significant structural load-bearing floors because it assumes there's heavy machinery. But in fact, cultivation is simply hundreds of plants spread out over significant square footage, and it's a very minor load. And so the larger issue here and the concern is that if this stands, we're going to have a large portion of cultivators in San Francisco who are not going to be able to abate this notice of violation. And what is going to happen when they try to get their annual permit and they still have an NOV for not changing their use case to F1? And I think that's just a larger question for all of the stakeholders, including the OOC. We see this as something that is that's going to need to be addressed because I certainly don't think that we want to have a number of pre-existing operators not able to comply.
Yeah, and to add to your point, Aaron, I think the problem is it's predicated on absolutely wrong information. Any of us that have cultivated are well aware that when you textiles and tobacco in there because they go through hardcore chemical washes, and that's why that textile and tobacco is really not the right example. Whereas, into Aaron's point, we use a little cocoa fiber, some soil, and CO2. Even if you are doing CO2 enrichment, there's a code for CO2 evacuation plans, from what I understand, that's just implemented into your mechanical. So I do think, to your point, Aaron, as well, while this, I think we do need to dig down deeper and see if this was based on guidance, because the state doesn't, they do not check that. This is all local authorization. So I think we should agendize this item on the next agenda, and we can't keep losing supply chain operators in the city. We already lost enough of them, in my opinion.
So let's do that. I don't want to continue to monopolize the discussion because I know this is very specific to cultivators. But if we could, whenever it makes sense, make a motion. And Lieutenant Tsai, thank you very much. Again, I know we put you on the spot. Maybe we could do, take 30 minutes in our next meeting and ask both DBI and fire to maybe do a little bit of digging so that we could have more discussion. I think the primary points we'd be interested in are exactly how many operators does this affect? How many cultivators still have this pending notice of violation to change their occupancy code to F1? And what kind of system can we come up with? Again, hardship exemption is one thought in which, the cultivator could have a structural engineer come in and legitimize the load, and so something to that nature. We do need to figure out a solution for this, and I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Tsai, as well. This was really important. I'm glad you brought it up, Aaron. I think, is there anything else regarding the DBI conversation? Because I do believe, given that Michael just said that planning is looking to have a person dedicated to cannabis, it would make sense for us to make a recommendation at the end of this point for the city, I don't know if the city controller or city staffing office, to speed this process up, that this is something that is of pretty high urgency to get rid of the backlog. And I still feel that we should have that at DBI as well. Because to your point, Jeff, earlier when you were presenting, let's say it takes 2 to 3 weeks in the best case to go through one station. I still believe it's 7 or 8 stations, right? So we're still talking about we're talking about a pretty long process here. So I don't think it would hurt to also ask for DBI to have a dedicated cannabis and even more so social equity permit handler. So that being said, I would like to open up for public comment, Jeremy, if you don't mind instructing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Jamalian. Regarding public comment for members of the public, please note that you have 2 options to provide public comment at this time. The first option is to call in by phone. If you would like to use this option, please dial please dial 1-415-655-0001, followed by this access code 2489-809-0520, followed by *3 when prompted to do. Option 2, you're welcome to submit comments by chat. The chat box is now open, and I will read your comments as they come in. It appears that we do have a comment via phone. Chair
Great.
Jamalian, are
Let's
you
hear
ready
it.
for public
Yes,
comment?
let's open public comment. Thank you, Jeremy.
Caller, you have 3 minutes and you've been unmuted.
Hi, it just told me I was unmuted. Just in that previous conversation about cultivation, I just wanted to clarify that applies to micro business cultivation as well as the larger cultivation, with the F1 change. That was my only question.
Thank you for your question.
caller. As a reminder, this is limited to comments only. We will continue to go through the queue. Caller, again, thank you for your comment. It does not appear that there are questions in the chat box, and I do not see another caller at this time.
Thank you, Jeremy. In that case, I would like to ask my fellow committee members if we have a motion to make a recommendation for planning and DBI to have a dedicated cannabis permit contact person as soon as possible.
So moved.
Second.
I didn't officially make the motion, so I should probably do that. I was asking if somebody would make the motion.
When I said so moved, I was making it.
Oh, okay. I didn't hear you, Teresa. All right. Fantastic. Get a vote, David.
Okay, seat 8, Chair Jamalian.
Aye.
Seat 9, Aaron Flynn.
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly.
Aye.
Seat 13, Nina.
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Hallinan.
Aye.
Seat 15, Teresa Folio Ramirez.
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously with 6 yeas, 0 nays, 0 abstentions, and 3 absent.
Thank you, David. That closes agenda item number 5. Given that agenda item number 6 is going to be a little bit lengthier, I would suggest we take a 15-minute break now and then just get through the next 2 agenda items. Is everybody okay with that? Fantastic. So we'll take a break now. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Would be 2:30. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Second part of our agenda. We're going to go to point number 6, which is the equity commitment discussion. I think many of the members on the board here that had to recuse themselves from this discussion can probably share some of my experiences as well, that there's a lot of ambiguity from the retailers' understanding of what social equity is, how to support it. And while a lot of the commitments that were made by MCDs, such as holding workshops and promoting equity brands, were kept, we still have a really hard time sort of identifying the shelf space discussion. It's hard to track. It's hard to prove that you're supporting social equity. I think what I get a lot, and please, my fellow members like Brendan, Nina, Sean, chime in here, but it seems like every retailer sort of has a different definition of it, and that there's not really a coherent way for them to report or track their equity commitments. So that's one thing that I wanted to bring up in this discussion. and any other commitment points such as non-owner related things. How do you carve out apprenticeships and other paths for social equity support? It can't just be buying product. Maybe we don't have enough product yet. Maybe the market is not understanding social equity. So I really want everyone's input here, because I think what we need to figure out at the end of this is to make a recommendation that makes it trackable and hold retailers accountable for their commitments. And that's sort of why this point came up, because multiple retailers asked me, well, how do I know I'm complying? I said, well, it's kind of ambiguous, so let's get to the bottom of this. And floor is open to all my fellow committee members for input, please.
And Chair Jamali, this is Nikesh with the OOC. Real quick, we did prepare a very brief presentation. The presentation is a recap of the legislation that relates to equity commitments for certain types of ownership transfer changes. But as you and most operators are well aware, that language is very similar to the equity commitments for MCDs and other operators. So what we wanted to do was just provide a brief overview of what those actual commitments are, just so everyone's on the same page, specifically in section 1608C9, but then just noting that they also would apply to how you could interpret the requirements for operators and MCDs and so on. So if that's helpful, we're happy to provide it. If it's not, also happy to.
Absolutely. No, absolutely, please.
Great. With that, John, would you mind sharing your screen and just walking the committee through the different commitments that Chair Jamalian was referencing? Thanks so much.
For sure. Good afternoon, Chair Jamalian and members of the committee. I have a brief presentation here where we're going to talk about section 1608. 1608 is available online. We've also included it in the appendix of this presentation if you're looking at the notes later down the line. Instead of reading the text, I'm just going to give a brief summary of what the code requires. First, as a reminder, if you are involved in the management of an equity business and you have an Article 16 permit, prior to changing the equity applicant's role, i.e., changing their managerial functions, making them no longer the CEO, or if you intend to reduce the ownership interest of verified equity applicants in your business, you are legally required to apply for a permit amendment from the Office of Cannabis. So if you don't have a permit amendment, you cannot change the structure of your equity business. Second, if the combined ownership interest of all the verified equity applicants in a business in an amendment plan is reduced to less than 20%. So if you have two equity applicants, their combined interest is less than 20%, then that requires that the business now submit a plan to the Office of Cannabis explaining how it's going to support the city's equity goals. And that plan is ongoing for the life of the permit of the business. So this is a commitment that will extend for the life of the permit. The code specifies a number of things. And just as a sort of brass tacks, when you submit a plan, you have to say what you're going to do in writing. You have to note the dates when you'll take those actions. You have to provide an estimated dollar value for each action. And you also have to provide the dollar amount of the gross sales of cannabis by the business during the most recently completed fiscal year. So these are all requirements written into city code. Now, the code does provide these actions that would allow a business to support the city's equity goals. The first is an annual contribution in cash, in-kind goods, services, or technical assistance equivalent to 1% of the permittee's gross sales to one or more community organizations. The second is training, mentorship, and employment opportunities to workers who are eligible to be equity applicants. The third is financial support, technical assistance, or rent-free commercial space to one or more equity operators. And the final is to source products from equity applicants or in San Francisco or outside of San Francisco. And these organizations that you are providing these services or goods to cannot, the owner of the business that's providing them can't have a ownership stake in the organization that they're providing them to. So that's a brief summary of the code. I think it might be helpful to leave these up here as we talk, but I'll turn the floor back to you, Chair Jamalian.
And Chair Jamalian, just before you open it up for discussion, I want to repeat that these actions that Deputy Director Pierce just went over, they relate to ownership transfer, the permit amendment that you have to submit when you are going to change your ownership, and it is triggered by a certain requirement, which he just went through. But the reason we're couching today's conversation with these particular actions and this code is because it's very similar to the requirements, the equity commitments that you just referenced as they relate to operators. So any guidance that is provided here will apply in that context and vice versa. So for anyone who's listening in and saying, well, why are we talking about it in this context if we're talking about the other context? It's because the guidance will apply in both cases because the language is virtually identical. And to the point that you referenced, when you just look at these actions, you can see that they are relatively open-ended, and we would appreciate the conversation to provide a little bit more concrete definition around what the parameters of meeting these actions look like. So if there are any questions about this presentation, how it relates to the conversation at hand, happy to take them. Just want to make that very clear.
No, thank you. And I think maybe we can just keep the slide up because to your point, it is going to be an extension of this. And this also the equity dilution bit that's currently in the code needs some more defining, right? So we can do that obviously in one go. I've been looking at the 1% contribution, for example. I think that's something that could be channeled to existing technical assistance providers. They could then in turn really start an apprenticeship program with existing operators where people really get hands-on experience working at a dispensary or at a grow or at a manufacturing, and they go to the existing TA provider for the academic part of it and the schooling part of it. And that could obviously be mapped onto an Article 16 holder as well. So yeah, I think fellow committee members look at these actions and see how can we define them and hold and give operators an option. I think there's a couple of really good ones in there. Rent-free commercial space in San Francisco is invaluable. That's a great way to make good on a commitment. But I do think that point 1 and 2 could possibly also be mapped onto the MCDs and as well. So with that, I open the floor for discussion.
And Chair Jamalian, just another point that might be helpful for this conversation is from the OOC standpoint, the concreteness helps, but so do recommendations that take in mind streamlining and enforcement, right? So we recognize that if you are submitting a permit amendment, that can take a significant amount of time. If there's clear guidance and that guidance is reinforced by a standardized process for actually checking whether what is being submitted is sufficient, that's also really important for us to expedite that process because we anticipate these permit reviews will take some time, and so will the equity commitment verification process. The more nebulous it is and the harder it is to actually enforce. So just another criteria as you guys provide feedback for what might make these more concrete.
Well, I think it's important to hear what the OOC's bandwidth is to that extent, because I mean, if we can come up with a concept that's great and aspirational, but if you can't enforce it, so I'd really like the OOC to be part of this discussion as well, at least in terms of what the bandwidth is. Is it easier to issue a reference number? Sure, that could be tracked locally, right? You have a reference number. This is a verified social equity applicant. You get a reference number from the OOC. You add that to your invoice. They can easily show you that they're doing a good amount of business with an equity operator. But is that enforceable? So I think as we are going to come up with ideas, please also feel free to chime in from the OOC's part. And if we're going down a route that's not going to be fruitful.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you even just flagging that and thinking what is the best way to make this practical. As a preliminary point, and you've heard this from representatives of other city departments, there are just staffing challenges and hardships across the city as a whole. The OOC is not immune from that. And even as we find creative ways to bring on new members, we are short-staffed. we are experiencing turnover, and I'm happy to provide some more updates a little bit later today. But the reality is that there's a lot to do, and the more complicated this particular process is for approving permit amendments and verifying equity commitments, the longer it will take. I want to be very clear that these processes will take time. They will take our office. I believe that they will take our office longer up front than they will later down the line, because we have to implement the processes for how we review and make sure that we can enforce them in a way that's standardized across time. So early on, if you do submit a permit amendment or you are submitting equity verification documentation, it will take a little bit longer under normal circumstances. But given our priority for permitting, for the temp permit events that are popping up, for grants distribution, and a variety of other projects that we're working on, it will take time. The short answer is that if the enforcement mechanisms and the guidance is clear, then it could cut it down. But I'm glad you asked, because it will take time, and we just want to let everyone know up front, and we appreciate the patience before we even engage with you. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. I'm happy to provide more concrete information, but just wanted to make that much clear.
Well, thank you for the clarification. And are you guys seeing already an increased demand in equity in ownership changes since this ordinance was ratified?
We're beginning to see, so it's a two-part answer. We're beginning to see concrete permit amendments, and we're also beginning to see the initial conversations around how they could be construed. So whether they have been tangibly submitted or it's just preliminary conversations, the reality is that this is now coming up. And one of the challenges we have, bandwidth, another challenge is we can't actually chime in on what would be acceptable or not prior to a permit being issued. So that's not something we could engage in to begin with. But to the extent that there are some clarifications or guidance being provided by the Cannabis Oversight Committee, it can help people as they begin to formulate their plans, even before they submit them to us. Now, even once those permit amendments are submitted, there will be a process where we need to review, we need to verify. The more complicated the permit amendments are and the more questions are raised, the longer that process could take. So again, it comes back to having clear guidance and having a clear set of expectations that can be standardized over time is the goal, but that is not naturally written into the legislation, as you can see. If you just read the language for 1 through 4, relatively open-ended, and that could really create delays in terms of identifying what is and what is not acceptable for these permit amendments.
Thank you, Nikesh. Yeah, so to Nikesh's point, we have to come up with pretty pragmatic recommendations, things that are actually attainable. And with that being said, now the floor is open.
I have two just clarification questions. So you're going back to the first slide, with the permit amendment, is there enforceable action if anyone is delinquent in submitting those applications, or a failure to submit applications if there is a change in equity ownership? And then two, is there a list of community organizations that so for action 1 that your contributions qualify for? Because if I give 1% of sales to, say, Move SF, that does nothing for equity in cannabis.
Good point, Ryan. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. I think, again, probably the most pragmatic and effective way of doing this is to allow that 1% to go through existing and future grant recipients that provide technical assistance, because we already all have a working relationship with them. They've been approved by the OOC already. They've received grant money. That grant money could then be more targeted towards, let's say, for each apprentice that you put through a 2-year apprenticeship program, you get this much in allotments, right? So I thought that would probably be the easiest and actually most realistic recommendation that we could make today.
And Chair Jamal and Member McGilly, I really appreciate you raising the questions, Member McGilly, and I also appreciate the suggestion. I think one other area to consider is that the Office of Cannabis has entered into partnerships with TA providers that are not grant funded. So it may be a useful exercise to consider how they fit into the fold of approved community organizations. These are organizations that we've worked with, that the community has received benefits from, we have a track record with. So it may not be a bad idea to include them. Member McGilly, I want to make sure that I'm answering your questions as well. So would you mind repeating the first question? And then I'll take the second one after that as well.
Yeah, so for the first slide, there was the permit amendment requirements if there was a change in ownership or a change in roles, step one. So my question was, what penalties or what enforcement mechanisms exist if a permit committee is delinquent in submitting this application or fails to submit this application at all?
Yeah, and I'm happy to let some of my colleagues answer this question. The short answer is that it could result in permit revocation, right? So a transgression on this front is significant enough that it could rise to the level of the permit being revoked altogether. The code itself makes clear that if there is a material change in ownership, so that tracks with this language, then that needs to be brought to the OOC's attention immediately. Now, when that actually happens depends on whether when it's supposed to happen depends on whether that change has happened pre-permit issuance or post-permit issuance. So that's where it gets a little bit more nuanced. But the short of it is that information is supposed to be brought to the OOC's attention. And if it is not, and it's found that it is not, then that could lead to a permit revocation. Now, I may have oversimplified a little bit. So my colleagues, if I did so, feel free to jump in and provide a little bit more nuance.
That's right, Director Patel. And even before that step, things like permit suspension until actions have been remedied.
And Member McGilly, I know you had a second question as well, so happy to take that.
Yeah, I just to follow, but outside of, I guess, self-identifying or having someone else in the industry call you out, what does the OOC have the resources or the bandwidth to investigate whether or not, equity ownership is being pushed out or is being changed on the back end like that? Because it's great that, to have a permit suspended or revoked if they're in violation, but how would we know if they're in violation?
And yes, and I'll just sort of jump in here real quick, and then Deputy Director Pierce, if you want to take it, feel free. You're raising a very good point, right? And part of this process right now has been getting to the point of a permit being issued. So this issue that you're raising is not one that the Office of Cannabis has had to deal with in the same way that we anticipate moving forward, because the bulk of our work has been prior to a permit being issued, meaning we're in steady communication with the applicant. We are always being apprised of their business changes, because before the permit can be issued, all that needs to be verified with the state. So there are just a lot of natural safety measures in play. Now, as we start rolling out more permits and the industry develops in terms of permitted businesses, that is an area that we're looking to shore up, and then also have more resources to be able to enforce. So you're sort of right on, you're hitting the nail on its head, but it hasn't necessarily been an issue yet because there are natural safeguards in place at this point in our process.
Yeah, and I think my second question, Chair Jamali, had kind of addressed as well, and I think that's going to be the bulk of our conversation. I think having a well-defined list of qualified community organizations is something that we need to at least create a framework for, if not, actually start naming names and listing off what qualifies and what doesn't.
I believe the OOC, Ryan, already has a list. So if there's a list of approved, whether they were grant recipients or not, maybe I was a little bit too specific, but if you have an approved list of community partners and technical assistance providers, I think that's a really good start, to Ryan's point. But Ryan, I would like to address some of the mechanics that you were kind of inquiring about. So there's a lot of ways to make agreements with equity applicants, especially when corporations do it, that the Office of Cannabis can't be privy to, because it would be kind of a gross overregulation of a private business. that can still drain the equity applicant's interest, especially the financial interests of in those companies, right? So I think one good way of spending some of that technical assistance money is actually to enable an equity applicant to go get legal services, particularly for that. That way, it's a good way to spend the money, but also it keeps the OOC out of over-regulating, right? So I think partnering up maybe with some or identifying some law firms that kind of specialize in these consultancy service agreements and these net profit agreements would probably really help out a lot of equity applicants while they still have some leverage on their joint venture partner.
Right. And I think that's where my concern really comes up, and where those situations would really happen is as we see more multi-state operators enter the market and start to conglomerate within San Francisco and within the Bay Area in general, that's happening more and more. They're using these, they're using BIPOC equity owners as their face up until the doors open, and then those people become either silent partners or get bought out completely, but they're still under operating under equity licenses. And that's I'm just curious what steps there are to take to prevent something like that from happening on a large scale.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you more. There's been a very apparent consolidation in retail that's affecting the Bay Area. But I do think educating the equity applicants sort of on their rights and giving them the opportunity to go with good attorneys that can identify the problems with those agreements would go a long way. And then I think training and mentorship, that's kind of where I would like some input from Brendan and Teresa on how you guys think we could, again, in a pragmatic and very doable way, do training, mentorship, and employment opportunities as part of an equity commitment. And I do think in the city, we do have a very close community of peers and companies that interact with each other. So there's a real opportunity here to do a kind of a pilot program for apprenticeships that will yield really good workforce. And I firmly believe that San Francisco can be the place where when you see that somebody was trained and went through a San Francisco apprenticeship program, that they'll be highly desirable workers anywhere in the cannabis industry. So with that, I'd like to kind of pass it to Teresa and Brendan for some input.
And Chair Jamal, and just before we do that, I think Member McGilly had raised a point that I think is useful for the committee's discussion for number one, which is having a designated list is important, and the community organizations you referenced, so those grant-funded TAs, both past, present, and future, as well as the TA providers that the Office of Cannabis has already partnered with, that's a great starting space. But I think for the committee, maybe not today, but during a future meeting, to spell out some criteria for consideration for additional community organizations would be very helpful. And I also just wanted to address Member McGilly's point about what is being done to make sure that businesses are really following the rules, especially as it relates to equity ownership. Every permit is subject to renewal on an annual basis. So there's also that point in this process where we can follow up for additional information and confirm that the business ownership structure is staying constant from the last time we permitted to when we're renewing. So I just wanted to make that clear, that once you receive a permit, it's not that it's in perpetuity. It needs to be renewed every year, and there are conditions that can be built into that process as well.
I just wanted to add to that before the Office of Cannabis issues a permit, we review the business structure with the equity applicant in detail. It's a long process. We go through all of their corporate governance documents, and we explain to the equity applicant, what their rights are and where their, what their requirements are for their ownership interests. So equity applicants are aware of what they're entitled to when they start this process, and we check it every year.
Yeah, spot on. Thanks, Sean.
I would also be really curious, to see like a review of what equity commitments were made and presented by operators when they were crossing over, right? Because everybody, like all the MCDs had to give equity plans, right? Those were available before on the Office of Cannabis website. And then for us to be able to see, like from the commitments that were made, what commitments were effective, and then also which ones weren't, right? And then who also committed shelf space, and to see like a good, and to hear back actually from the retailers of like what makes it very difficult to be able to meet that requirement, because I think that would be very helpful for equity applicants to even know that. And also to see who, like in lieu of having to go through every single person's equity commitment, right? Being able to actually see like who actually committed shelf space, right? To even know like who, us as equity brands, how can we target those specific ones to hold them accountable, right? And then also to be, to have you guys assist us in holding them accountable, I think is a very, like sound way of us all teaming up together and being able to work towards collective accountability, right? Especially for the shelf space piece. And then another thing, just to kind of add to the community organizations, just to put some philosophical, just food for thought out there. When, like with the war on drugs, right? The war on drugs did a multitude of harms to communities, right? One, it dismantled Black and brown leadership, right? It made it so individuals who had convictions weren't able to attain higher learning grants in order to be able to get more of the acumen necessary to be successful in this type of society, right? Other things where there was like a breakdown in family structures for people that were arrested, bullied by police officers, and or put into long-term lockup, right? So from that, there's a lot of like mental health issues that come up, so like when we're thinking about organizations, right, that can help to heal the harms from the war on drugs, because like it's just not trying to hand out like money to just anybody, but we're looking for very specific impacts in again healing the harms caused by the war on drugs, right? So just trying to add some philosophical food for thought into play when we're brainstorming around like what are the desired impacts as we move forward with these equity plans.
Thank you, Nina. And I do agree that I'm sure, Nina, you've done it as well. I sometimes go through the old equity commitments and read them for fun, and there's a big disconnect between what's actually going on and what was originally committed. But those commitments were also sometimes, like you said, some actually said shelf space, but the other ones are so aspirational and so ambiguous that it really keeps the operator from ever having to comply with it. So I actually think going through a lot of the MCDs, you would be shocked how little equity product you find in those versus the new ones. So I definitely agree with Nina that we need to come up with, I really like what you said with a joint effort to kind of verify. And I think that's not that unrealistic. If there was just an email address at the OOC that was, you can send your complaints here, I'm sure that you would see that a couple people would write there and say, hey, I couldn't find equity products in any of these sex stores, for example, which would then be like, okay, we should probably verify that these guys are holding up their commitment, right? So I do think Nina noticed a pretty important disconnect between some of the older commitments that were made originally in 2017 and today's practices. So yeah, coming up with maybe a simple way to track that would be helpful.
I think that would probably be helpful to I would just speaking for the MCDs, my involvement in some MCDs. I know when the equity plans were originally designed, I think that the expectation was that they were going to be, very temporary. I think it was originally, there was a 1 year to process the applications for MCDs to convert to Article 16s. And then, now we're in 2022. So I think, I think a lot of them were done kind of like at a different, to your point, Ollie and Nina, like they were done at a different time before a lot of this stuff had shaken out from in the Office of Cannabis, seeing how things work, but also the MCDs seeing what works and what doesn't. And I think a lot of the things that at first worked, like having, like get-togethers, kind of like job fair things, or didn't have as much traction after a year as they did during the first year. So just as an example, I think it would be good to further define these things. And I just want to also note, while I have the floor, that we did also make our recommendation for item number 4. I think we made our recommendation for 10% shelf space, right? So I just want to remind everybody of that. I believe that's where we ended when we did those recommendations a few months back.
I thought it was 25%.
There was a few numbers thrown around at the last minute, but the only one I see in writing is 10%. But
yeah, I think we settled for 10. And Brendan, I actually hope that we have a lot of public comment, to your point, from MCDs hopefully today, because and Nina made that point earlier as well, defining to them how to comply. It is also unfair to ask somebody to comply to something that's ambiguous. So I just want to make sure I wasn't trying to say that these are bad players as much as it's just very difficult to comply, right? So yeah, it would be nice to, if you think about like the workshops and stuff, right, you're right, they worked really well in the beginning, but now most of those people that were holding those workshops have graduated to their own brands and have a business to run, and therefore they're not very effective anymore, right? So yeah, let's come up with some solutions, but defining it for the MCDs should be a really big goal of ours today.
Through the chair. So I did want to bring up, since you called me out, about workforce development. Under number 2 and I'll speak to the workforce and training as far as pre-apprenticeship, apprenticeship. Several years ago, legislation was passed that once OEWD, so the Office of Economic and Workforce Development, approves a pre-apprenticeship program, that then it triggers state certified apprenticeship. Once they get into that realm of state certified or state registered apprenticeship, it's much easier to track, because the state has certain requirements, the Department of Apprenticeship Standards, on tracking hours, training, all of that. One thing that is key and missing is the pre-apprenticeship part. And then being able to connect, because I know that San Francisco went more with the first source kind of hiring. But there are a lot of community-based organizations that there are people that are definitely, equity applicants and could be eligible, that would want to have an opportunity in training. So it would be connecting those CBDs, like if there was a list of those community-based organizations that are in the workforce development realm, and then being able to connect them and getting OEWD to actually approve a pre-apprenticeship program to start the pipeline, because those are the things that we're kind of missing in that pipeline.
I'm pretty sure that the Success Center is running a apprenticeship program at this point, because I know a few people that are going through their training and waiting to be placed once they are fully through their program.
I think so as well, but I don't think it's a state certified one. That's the difference. And I see what, Teresa, what would you need from the industry? What are the next steps? Like if there was 7 action items to get to a pre-apprenticeship program, what is it that we as an industry have to make happen?
Well, I mean, if the Success Center is already doing like a non state certified apprenticeship, but I mean that if OEWD recognize that as a pre-apprenticeship, that's one pathway. So to have OEWD needs to recognize a pre-apprenticeship training program. From there, it would connect into the state certified, but then we would also need to have a CBD, a community-based or a community-based organization, a CBO, to have the eligibility pool, because you would need to have those folks that are equity applicants or eligible equity applicants that want to pursue that career pathway.
I believe, to Nina's point, Success Center actually fulfills all of those requirements.
They do.
They're phenomenal.
So back in 2019, I actually got a contract with the OEWD to consult on their apprenticeship program. So myself and then Leslie Valencia actually put together a good structure for what that would look like for OEWD. It's like an 80-page report. I can definitely make that available to all of you guys. And like having to, and like it also has to do, like we talked to several different other organizations, Success Center being one of the key ones, but there's like a few other ones that for the city to really get behind and create almost like a council of them, right? So that was the recommendation, so that there was wraparound supports for all of the members that would go, or not the members, all of the potential apprentices that would go through these programs, so that there is a well-networked service. Because again, with folks that are in different neighborhoods, you know, like we wanted to ensure that it wasn't just one neighborhood, considering what some of the climate is for folks in San Francisco. There's individuals that are in HP that can't necessarily go to Fillmore or can't go to Sunnydale or some of the other areas. So it's very key to ensure that either there's a neutral territory that some of this, the apprenticeship takes place on, or there's multiple programs in different places.
And it sounds like we have one component of it. And then where do these apprentices get trained at the moment? Because that's sort of what I was asking, what can we do as an industry? We would need to come up with some sort of minimum requirements for a business to qualify to take apprentices, right? Is that and Teresa, to your point earlier, I don't think the first source hiring is working well in the city. Unfortunately, it's really not working well. So we do need an alternative to that. So we would need manufacturers, distributors, and retailers to effectively be vetted, and then they would qualify. Is there a predefined vetting process for other industries that we could map onto the cannabis industry?
Not really a vetting process. I mean, there are ratio components generally with apprenticeship, you know, like a 4-to-1 ratio is pretty much the standard. You know, there with the state's registered apprenticeship program, there are 4 pathways: cultivation, pharmacy tech, manufacturing, and delivery. So there's those 4 different pathways. Most of the apprenticeship, and this is true in most cases, most apprenticeship get their OJTC, on the job training, hours and curriculum. Most of it is actually on the job with, you know, some school work or book work, so to speak. So as long as they can meet the ratio and are able to sign on to what the curriculum is, because you do want it to kind of match. But most of the time, it's not just steady school, like weekly, or, you know, it may be a certain amount of time in the classroom over the period of 2 years.
Okay, so it's not like Monday through Wednesday you're working at the shop and Thursday, Friday you're in school.
Correct.
That's how it is in Germany. That's the only reason I'm asking. That's the only apprenticeships I know are actually structured that way. Okay, that makes sense. I think with the 4-to-1 ratio, we probably have quite a few businesses that can take on a couple of apprentices in the city. And are these
Supervisor Safai just recently passed a minimum requirement for apprentice hire. I think it's like 30%, 35%. For all
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, that was the legislation that was passed several years ago. But
no, this was last
more
November.
recent?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because the other one was triggered with a pre-apprenticeship. So maybe they did qualify Success Center. I'll have to check into that.
Teresa, what would a recommendation look like to implement this? Can we get kind of specific about it?
Let me put some thought into it real quick.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a pretty good idea of the 1%. I'm pretty confident we'll have a decent pathway for pre-apprenticeship now that we identified the moving parts that exist and what we need to add to it. And I think the financial support in terms of technical assistance and rent-free commercial space, that's the least ambiguous one. That's the one that's probably most defined. Is there a cap? How can I ask the OOC for some guidance here. What's the rent-free commercial space? How far is it defined in terms of percentage of existing space? Is there a dollar cap amount on it?
Jeremy, if you have a pretty good sense of this, feel free to answer. If not, I can jump in.
Sure. So the initial thoughts is that's what this discussion is attempting to accomplish. But as an analogy, things like the Department of Public Health's Article 33 incubation, which has rent-free commercial or the equivalent at a market rate and depending on the square footage, so that if there's a desire for an analogy, that would be a good thing to look at, but otherwise, this is part of the conversation we're having.
Thank you, Jeremy. Again, I always think for the sake of keeping things pragmatic, if there is already a matrix that nobody had a problem with, then that's probably not a bad place to start. Teresa, whenever you're done brainstorming, please take the floor back. We're just trying to kill time while you're coming up with something brilliant.
No, I mean, I'm trying to put like, nuts and bolts together. I mean, I could give you a 30,000 foot, but I think that's not what everybody's really looking for. Like something a little bit more concrete for a recommendation. Let me think about it.
Member Foglia Ramirez, if it's helpful, maybe a little bit of a way to give you some time is, Chair Jamal, and we go back to number 1 and just give David a sense of what that vote might look like before actually putting it, or what the recommendation itself would actually look like from a nuts and bolts drafting it out. That'll take some time, but if we do it on the front end, then that can give Member Foglia Ramirez a little bit of time, and then that'll save time on the back end when we're figuring out what the motion should be. Just a suggestion.
That's great. I'm happy to do that. So I think Ryan, you probably had the most thoughts on point number 1 already.
Yeah, I mean, I think starting with grant organizations that have gotten approval for grants is a good starting point, but building out the criteria, because we don't want to limit to just people who are receiving the money, and we don't want to exclude people who are doing the work but just aren't on any of our radars. So I think we need to, I don't really have the wording for it or
That's all right. I believe
the framework built in my head yet, so I don't know how to really express it, but I think just having certain high watermarks to hit to qualify, and not just
anyone, sure,
any nonprofit community organization. That can be any, that can be a Democratic club, and like, what are they going to do?
Well, it may be helpful, David, if you have been taking notes, to share your screen just so we can pull up the section where this conversation was being had, and then that way it can help draft some of the language.
Yeah, because I have a few things that you said, Nikesh, that I noted, which was present, existing, and future technical assistant providers. So that way we kind of kept it a little bit more open. And then you had mentioned that it would be good to get a little definition of the requirements for these technical assistance providers. That will probably tie into what Teresa is doing right now. So we can snag that out of there, I assume. And then, so then streamlining the enforcement. So maybe we can start with the mechanism by which that 1% is channeled through the OOC to technical providers and then to apprentices. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think as just a quick point of clarification, the criteria I was referring to was in line with Member McGillie's point, which is there's the defined universe that you can propose right now, which is any organization that has previously received a TA grant or is in the process of, or will or may in the future, as well as the TA providers the Office of Cannabis is partnered with that are not being funded by TA grants. So those two pools, because they're already sort of defined. And then the other piece of this would be for the Cannabis Oversight Committee to determine a set of criteria that can be used in filtering future organizations to this list. So it's not defined, but at the same time, or it's not limited, but it's still defined in the moment. So that was sort of where we were there. And in doing all that talking, Chair Jamalian, I forgot what your actual question was. So if you could repeat it, I'm happy to answer it.
No, you pretty much answered it. I was just asking if, because you had said recipients and of grant, you just answered it, non-grant as well as recipients, past, present, future. And the point was to also include the non-grant provided technical assistance providers that you guys have already identified. So I think if we can just kind of say that it's the current list as well as any additions to that list in the future would be qualified. That would kind of cover that base. And then to your point, if we put in some language that identifies the addition of future technical assistance providers that might not adhere to either of those two should also be kept open. Is that correct?
That's right. I think you could have a conversation an agendized conversation at a later point to determine what those criteria might be for the additional organizations that are included, but to leave it open-ended so as to say that additional organizations may be included per criteria the COC would recommend at a future point. That would, I think, achieve the objective that I've heard some of the members describe, and then at the same time provide a defined list so it gives us a little bit of direction right now. And I think whenever that recommendation is made, just to be very specific, that it's the TA providers that have received grant funding or in the process of or may in the future, as well as those TA providers the OOC has partnered with that are not grant funded, but have been providing equity services to social equity applicants since the inception of the program, and a future list contingent upon criteria that the COC will help to elaborate at a later point in time. I think those are like the three big buckets.
Yeah, I think we're aligned. I hope Hanan is taking notes and wordsmithing already.
Yeah, can I perhaps if it could help to ground this, if I could have permission to share my screen. My notes are a little bit segmented, so if I can show you what we could define these three groups and make sure we have it. If I could
Absolutely. You are in the process of being a presenter. You should be good to go.
Okay, so I have some additional notes here. So it was Nikesh, TA providers who have or are in the process of applying for and or may receive TA grants in the future. That was the first category. The second one was those that are currently partnering with the OCC that are not recipients of TA grants.
But have provided.
But that provide TA services to social equity applicants. And Jeremy, feel free to help wordsmith this if there's any inaccuracies or if it can be a little bit more concise.
Will do.
Okay, I make that bigger. So this is big enough for folks to read.
I might add to clarify the and or may receive a TA grant award to give it a little bit more body.
And was this to, just for my clarification, this was to ensure or expand the list of community providers to include these specified individuals.
Are you talking about to include the future ones or the ones that already provided services?
I just wanted to make sure I had the opening correct, to include.
I see. Perhaps the hook or the thread is include as a part of a plan, because this is all in light of the potential permit amendment.
And this is a semantic issue, but just to avoid confusion down the line, for the second clause here, where it says "and those that are partnering with the OOC," I think it's probably better to also make that partnering or have partnered with the OOC.
Thanks, Nikesh.
And I'll note, as David is so kindly fleshing this out, Ollie, if it's helpful, I found the applicable code section regarding rent. If that's something you're interested in, I'm happy to read it. And of course, if a DPH partner would like to speak to their code section, then I would defer to them as well.
I think our DPH partner is skipping the meeting today, but yes, it would be really, really helpful if you could read that out. Thanks, Jeremy.
Sure. So,
hey, Jeremy, just before you read that though, to close the loop on this first recommendation, I think the only piece that's missing is the part about leaving room for additional organizations to be included based on criteria provided by the Cannabis Oversight Committee at a future point. Sorry to interrupt.
Thanks, Nikesh. No, I kind of thought we were covering that, but you're right. That was a different point, because that's still the grant award recipients.
Does that look great, Nick? So leaving room for additional organizations to be added contingent upon criteria to be developed by the COC?
Now, my question there is this, are we the one developing the criteria, or is there going to be a legislation maybe anyway, or is there an existing, that's why I was kind of asking for Teresa's language, or is there like a state approved sort of language for organizations that provide apprenticeships or other services that we could add to that? But I guess this leaves it a little bit more open for us to kind of include all that at a future point. Was that your thinking, Nikesh?
Yeah, and I think if you just look at these categories, that first category is the equivalent of 1% of gross sales for a variety of different services, whereas number 2 is very specific to workforce. So I think here the criteria for number 1 could be broader, so they're not limited to a particular workforce development or an organization that provides pre-apprenticeship work, and it's maybe a little bit broader to organizations that provide mental health services or something outside the scope of what's in number 2.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for clarifying. All right, Jeremy, let's hear the rent.
Sure. So for the record, this is Health Code Section 3311 B3B 1 and 2. There is either on-site rent-free commercial space that's either adjacent to a permittee's premises or off-site. The off-site consideration is the greater of 800 square feet or the equivalent of at least 10% of the square footage of the permittee's premises, the incubator, the person that is conveying that benefit. Again, this is just an example in a similar situation to help further this discussion.
Did you say minimum of 800 square feet or equivalent to 10% or?
Correct.
Okay, that makes sense. 800 square feet in the city. Tried out a lot of stores that could sustain a license with 800 square feet. I would say that even just the requirements, just the compliance requirements in terms of storage, entrance, would already rule out an 800 feet property. So maybe we should raise that a little bit. Do we have some opinions from any of the other committee members, especially those with different size properties or storefronts? Well, in that case, I would just kind of say we should, if the recommendation could include, is it max or minimum of 800 square feet? It says max there.
Oh, I think it was minimum.
Okay. I mean, I think in the city, you will probably not even find a space to get permitted for about under, and that's really low already, like $5,000 a month. That would be incredibly low. So I don't know if it should go by square footage or if a dollar amount doesn't make more sense. And this is again, this is going to the permit amendments, correct? This is when a equity applicant is dropped below 20%. Or if they want to open another, or if an MCD wants to open a second location, they could also go the incubation process. Is that correct?
I apologize. Would you mind repeating the question?
If an existing Article 33 wants to open a second location, could they also take advantage of the incubation program?
I see what you're saying. Interesting. So without the benefit of all the facts and circumstances, nuances apply. Sure, there is an incubation tier to incubate an equity applicant in return for priority processing. As our longtime operators know, there's a cap on ownership or beneficial interest in storefront retail locations. However, MCD ownerships have been grandfathered in. So keeping the cap in mind would be helpful for whoever wants to pursue that concept.
Sure, but I think that kind of really helps us frame the value of the incubatee. And I think it's more than 800 square foot.
Chair Jamalian, just doing a time check. It's 3:33, so we have a little under 30 minutes. And I know that we still have to take public comment. So just recommending that if there's going to be a vote, then it makes sense to open up to public comment. Like you said, there may be a lot of interest in this particular topic. And then this item can also be agendized to be continued at a subsequent meeting if there are additional, let's say, points 2 and 4 that you want to pick up at a later point. You can make recommendations as they relate to the ones you feel more confident about right now. So just proposing it, given that we're
Totally agree. Absolutely. No, I agree. And I think we've discussed all the recommendations we want to draft. So at this point, opening for public comment makes sense. So with that being said, Jeremy, would you do the honors?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair Jamalian and company. Regarding public comment for members of the public, please note that you have 2 options to provide comment at this time. The first option is to call in by phone. If you would like to use this option, please dial 1-415-655-0001, followed by this access code, 2489-809-0520, followed by *3 when prompted to do so. Option 2, you're welcome to submit your comments by chat. The chat box is now open. I will read your comments as they come in. It does appear that we have several callers in the queue. I will quickly get oriented here to select those to provide public comment. Caller, you have been unmuted. Call-in user 11, you have 3 minutes for your comment, beginning now. Call-in user starting with 415368. I have unmuted you to provide your public comment.
Oh, hey, my apologies. That was from the earlier discussion. I didn't. I guess I didn't remove myself. I'm not sure how I was supposed to do that.
Not a problem. We'll move on. Thank you for your comment and clarification. Next caller, you have been unmuted. Your 3 minutes begins now. And it appears that the commentor, let's see here. We may have someone who submitted their comment via chat instead. I see. A quick clarification, Nikesh, regarding decorum, anonymized comments or can call them by name?
Anonymized comments.
I see. With that being said, caller, I will read your comment in the chat box. Are there any existing grants accessible to equity applicants? Again, this is limited public comment. For questions, you're welcome to start off by reviewing our website. Lots of materials there. I will move on to the next caller. Caller, you have been unmuted. Your 3 minutes begins now.
Hello, everyone. My name is Walter Redding. I'm equity verified. I just want to let everybody know and peek my head in, and I'm so proud of this group, and I'm so proud of everybody having a voice on a platform for equity. This is amazing. I just wanted to let you know that I have been wrongfully dealing with a fraudulent investor. So I just wanted to give you guys a head up. I started my equity defense team just for people just like that, for a bunch of frauds that's going around in San Francisco around this cannabis stuff. So I just wanted to say hello, everybody. My name is Walter Redding, and be on the lookout for the equity defense team.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Going to the chat box, I don't see an additional comment there. I will circle back to the call list. It appears that there are no, actually one more just came in. Caller, you've been unmuted. Your 3 minutes of public comment begins now.
Hello, grant team or Cannabis Oversight Committee. My question is, I don't know if we've passed this subject or not. My name is Alex Asefal. I am a verified equity applicant in the process of opening a dispensary here in the city. In reference to the grant amount, how I noticed that last year the amount was capped at 100K, if I'm not mistaken. And this year, the amount has been capped at around 50,000 per the recent grant announcement. Although I'm thankful for it, and I'm very appreciative of all the work you guys do, I was wondering how did we come to that number, and how is that more beneficial to an equity applicant such as myself, who narrowly missed the cutoff for last year's grant amount, which would have helped me out tremendously. And if we're trying to truly get equity for these equity applicants, that extra 50K could potentially offset having to give up a significant amount of equity to a potential investor or other. So sorry for being long-winded, but my question, at the core of it is how do we get from 100,000 to 50,000? And I yield my time there.
Thank you for your comments. As Jeremy always reiterates, we can't answer your questions, but all of those information is available on the OOC site, and I'm sure you will find it without any problems.
And Chair Jamal, and I would just add that for the caller, if you want to direct that question to our office, feel free to reach out to us, and we can definitely provide some background as to the amount and the thought process, and ultimately the parameters in place that dictate how that money can be dispersed. So thanks for the call.
I will circle back to see whether there are additional commenters in the queue. Nothing in the chat. Going to the call list. There are no additional commenters at this time.
Thank you, Jeremy. So that concludes public comment, and then we can go into actually drafting our recommendation around this subject. So I think, David, if you could share your screen again, and we could just kind of knock the, I believe, 2 or 3 that we were pretty close to. Nikesh, is that right?
Yeah, I saw that the first one seems like it's relatively final. Then there was the second one that member Foglia Ramirez was thinking through, and maybe that's one to table at a later point if there's still more time that's needed. And then I know that committee members discussed the equity, the shelf space and equity commitments, and so maybe just to formalize something there. What I can say from our end on that side, on that piece is there are just some having a way to enforce and to be able to actually have a mechanism to account for how much of the overall shelf space is dedicated to equity is a tool that's helpful for us. That's not something that we currently have at our disposal. And so I just want to throw that out there that there's 2 challenges that we face at the Office of Cannabis. One is how to confirm that something is actually an equity product, and 2, then how to determine how much of the overall shelf space that may have took. And the reason that that's important is because I think right now there are a lot of factors that we as an industry are not familiar with. And one of the questions that I think should be pressing for everyone is how much equity product is there that can be shelved, and is there a gap between how much product there is and how much is actually being shelved? Because that's an area that we could certainly hone in on. We just don't know what that delta looks like at this point in time. So any recommendations that might help bridge that would be helpful.
I think the way I would approach it, just from a pragmatic point of view, would be that self-reporting, that the dispensaries can, file an affidavit that says this is the percentage at the end of the year. Pull a report from your QuickBooks of just the percentage of equity product that you sold. I just don't think we'd have enough data yet, but I think that would be a pretty low-hanging fruit, and then maybe a tip line for consumers to send an email to the OOC if they see that there's a complete lack of equity products. And again, starting kind of with the lower hanging fruit, where the OOC can pick up a phone and call an operator and say, hey, we got a complaint that you don't have equity product. And then I don't know if that's something doable from the OOC side.
Yeah, Chair Jamal, I'll get to that in a moment. I think the other piece of this is the mechanism for identifying a equity product, right? That's been a challenge for our office. So it's a representation that this is an equity product, but if you have, or the committee has, any suggestions for how we might actually be able to pinpoint that, recognizing that there's local equity product and then there's equity product across the state, and one may be easier for us to track than the other, but that's an area that might be helpful. And then as far as the tip line goes, hate to belabor the point, but just with limited resources and bandwidth, it's something that we could certainly create. The attention that would be able to be paid to it would probably lower on the priority of things that are going on right now. So I think it's a great idea, and one that makes even more sense when we're staffed up. But right now it would be something we could create, but maybe not tend to as quickly as we'd like to. And we have a policy of just trying to turn around and respond as quickly as we can. But that's been challenging as of late, and I suspect it'll continue to be challenging until we've staffed up.
No, I understand that, and I don't think anyone's gonna really be asking you how many enforcements you did a month. But I think having that language in there for a future date when you are properly staffed wouldn't hurt.
I'll just chime in real briefly to Nikesh's point, in regards to how much access retailers have to equity product. When we were discussing earlier, and Nina and Brendan chimed in about the amounts of shelf space we were talking about requiring, and I think 10% is what we had written down, although 25% had been discussed. What I recall is that 25% was initially broached, but then we said, hey, access to equity product is, the supply chain is really still coming online. So I think we, landed at that lower amount. And I think that's just an important consideration to continue here, when we're assigning amounts, or to have some kind of scale, or really recognize that this is, something that's still, the supply chain is still stabilizing and building. And we want to make sure that we don't, burden retailers with unrealistic requirements, especially if they just simply can't get their hands on certain products.
Right. And to that point, Aaron, is exactly, we can tie that right into the affidavits and the self-reporting. That's why we need that data. Until we know what's realistically sold, you can't demand from a retailer to give 10% of shelf space if he's only able, in the best case, to fill 5. But if he's able,
stay away from any type of specific
I
number.
agree. That's why I think self-reporting is key. And
Agreed.
then we have data similar to other problems that we're facing in this industry, where we're just short of data. We don't have data to make a good decision yet.
The tricky thing is just that since there's no statewide database of who qualifies for equity in different jurisdictions too, that gets a little bit tricky. If it's just San Francisco, I think it's a little easier. But if you're talking about, I believe the language we had in there earlier was, or any other qualified equity applicant from another jurisdiction. So that could get a little tricky. I don't know if you can just call the, not every city has an office of cannabis, but if how you would call and verify who is equity and who isn't, if it's people that aren't, businesses that aren't from San Francisco. So.
Well, I think our primary concern should only be San Francisco. So if we can, Nikesh, would it be difficult for the Office of Cannabis to track a reference number given to an equity applicant? Would that be a very burdensome for you guys?
Chair Jamali, walk me through what you're thinking in terms of how to operationalize that. So provide an equity applicant a specific number, and then what would come next after that?
Well, the way that we do it, our practice has been, we just took a little, sanitized our permits from the city that just have our actual city permit numbers on there. And by having, by the number, they can send that to you, that's a permit you issued. That was the easiest way for us to do it without putting a burden on you. That's just the best practice thing that anyone that has a social equity permit can just do. Go to Photoshop, sanitize the address and whatnot, and just, give them your permit number. But I guess my question is from an enforcement side. If I was an MCD and sent you a report that I have been supporting permit number 6, 8, 9, 11, and 12, for example, would that be something that would suit you guys' workflow, and would that be a verification process that's acceptable?
So the answer to that first question is yes, that would be helpful. And in terms of the existing infrastructure that we tapped in, every verified equity applicant is assigned a verified equity applicant number. So using the VEA number would be one way that would be very easy for us to say, okay, well, this operator is saying that they shelved product from this VEA number. Then we'd go back, look at the VEA number, and confirm with them that that was actually the case. That would be a relatively easy way for us to track equity product that's been shelved by local equity applicants. To member Hallinan's point, outside of San Francisco, more statewide, that wouldn't address the issue.
Well, again, we want to track the local. We care about our local equity applicants. We care about the rest, but this is where we have some control and some influence over, right? Could we just, though, because the VA numbers have a value, and I wouldn't want to give mine just away, could we do the last 4 digits of the VA number?
I could take a slice at this, Director Patel. So Chair Jamalian, I think the question is it technically difficult to assign a number to the VA applicant? The answer is no. The technical difficulty will come in the form of our office asking or requiring vendors to submit that information in a standardized way. because different businesses will keep their books differently. Everyone will submit 100 different formats to us. We won't be able to standardize it. So how this would work is that we would give you a form that you would have to fill out every quarter or month or year. And then it's a question of, do you think that the vendors would actually do that? And do you think that they would report honestly?
I do. I do think the vendors would report honestly. I think everyone that holds a license knows the value of that license and will do very little to jeopardize that license.
So also, like a collective of equity applicants from actually all around the state, we've been working on the equity trade certification, so which could be found at the Equity Trade Network.
I have to stop you on that. That's a conflict of interest. I'm glad you brought it up, but I have to stop you right there.
But it's also what I want to say
private
also
enterprise.
is that we've been working with the Humboldt County with their equity program too, to help to identify their equity applicants for other people as well.
Thank you, Nina.
All right. But it's all good. I have a little bit more on this term, and then we can start working on that more fully around the state. So
thank you.
Hey, quick question. So the number you were just referring to, the VEA, that's not the license number though, right? That's just the qualified applicants number.
Correct. What do you see? I feel like you think there's a problem with that. Would you elaborate on your hesitation on that?
No, I'm just thinking it through, but I mean, I guess because I just would there have to be some sort of connection between the two, or I mean, I don't, because I guess if it's a product that's made and has a license on it, that's a different license, let's say, like, but then it's how is it connected to the VEA? Does the VEA have to be an owner of that licensed entity, or is it? I'm just trying to figure out what the connection between.
Well, if you're a verified equity supply like brand, right? You have a VEA if you're a verified equity applicant. So let's just say a verified equity applicant has their product co-packed by a non-equity company, right? So for that particular line of product, you could submit the VEA's number, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about like the connection, but so like what would the connection have to be between that VEA and the product? Like they would have to have like just own the product. That's whatever that means. If it's co-packed by a non-equity owned entity.
I think that's exactly why we're having this conversation, because of right. That's sort of the driver of this conversation. I think for now, at least, it allows to track San Francisco verified equity applicants and what their impact on the market is. If nothing else, we'll at least know, is there 20 or is there 30 of us out there, right? So that would be helpful already. And I think with the issue packaged by non-equity actors, that is sort of a state issue that Nina was also alluding to, and that we have to kind of wait for the state to flush that part out. But we could start with our own little pilot project, let's call it that.
And then Chair Jamalian, just doing a time check, it's 3:53. I think the first recommendation is pretty final. This is a good time to finalize any of the other recommendations that you'd like to put to a vote, and then there'll just be general public comment and a brief update from the OOC at the end. So.
Sorry, recommendation number 1 is pretty final, so agreed on that. Teresa, if you need more time on wordsmithing recommendation number 2, happy to table that.
I have it'll be really brief. I just wanted to I was doing some research over here. I did contact OEWD, and they do not have or they haven't approved a pre-apprenticeship yet. I did try to search for the most recent legislation as it relates to cannabis apprenticeship, and I did put in a text to the supervisor. But working off of the one that's from several years ago that I'm aware of with the 35%, the recommendation can be as simple as that we recommend OEWD to certify a pre-apprenticeship program. In that legislation, the supervisor Safai, now, I mean, caveat that it didn't change drastically, but in that legislation, OEWD could only certify pre-apprenticeship programs that had a connection to a community-based organization. So that takes care of the first layer as far as participants coming in with that are equity. Then once that certifies, they also certify that ones that have an MOU with an apprenticeship program. So that if we could just get OEWD to approve a pre-apprenticeship program, I think that triggers the other parts of the legislation and covers our bases.
Right. So our recommendation would then be to recommend OEWD identify and approve a pre-apprenticeship program in San Francisco.
Yeah, or several. Yeah, but that's the crux of it.
And the question I would ask then is what would the connection to that certification be with respect to this second criteria or commitment?
But can we just go back, sorry, Nikesh, and make that plural instead of singular to Teresa's point?
So what it would do is it would give those folks, if they wanted to do recommendation 2 or option number 2 with apprenticeship, then and I'm just working on apprenticeship because mentoring is a whole nother dynamic that's a little bit harder to track and enforce. But once this happens, then there would be a pathway in regards to getting them to apprenticeship and then getting them to the state register that does all the tracking under the Department of Apprenticeship Standards. So that's how you would know if they were truly in compliance, if they were truly participating, because then the Department of Apprenticeship Standards, they audit programs, so you get to see success rates and everything.
Now, I appreciate that. I guess the next piece of the recommendation would just be tying the recommendation that OEWD certify a pre-apprenticeship program into how an equity permit holder could meet this requirement. I think it's just in the recommendation, that piece is missing. It's sort of a standalone statement right now. This should happen, but there's no connection to how. I think what's missing is that the equity permit holder would need to select one of these certified pre-apprenticeship programs or these certified pre-apprenticeship programs. So I don't know if that makes sense. I'm happy to try again, but I think there's just a nexus missing.
Nikesh, I think you're referring to the same thing that David did earlier, to include as part of the equity plan, correct? That's what you're...
I think it's simple as that, just a semantic point.
So that, and I also think we should set it up for what you were saying, Teresa, that this is in order to trigger a state certification, because the objective isn't just the pre-apprenticeship, but to escalate that to a full apprenticeship program.
Yeah, providing that, the legislation didn't change drastically, that would trigger that legislation.
2 already, I feel like then that is pretty final. So what's the take on the shelf space? I think we need to trim that down a little bit. There was a lot of ideas there. So, and the challenges that you outlined have to be addressed in the recommendation.
Real quick through the chair, I'm sorry. Under number 2, programs to trigger state certified apprenticeship.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you.
Are we okay with dumbing this down to a pilot project in order to establish a benchmark data by just tracking local VEAs in a nutshell?
Chair Jamal, and I think the other piece you had added was a calculation of the overall shelf space as a percentage.
Yeah, I meant including the affidavit part. Yes, sorry. Yeah. But we need that to create a benchmark and actual availability and sell-through rates of equity products.
That's right. I think just to avoid the ambiguity of how that benchmark may be set, to just spell it out in the recommendation as well. But yes, you're right.
Self-reported sell-through rates of San Francisco equity products using the VA number as a tracking mechanism. All right, so I think that pretty much sums up the recommendations. And on the rent space, I think we can definitely table that for the next time. I think it would be kind of haphazard to make a recommendation right now. And we should really feel out, talk to some ongoing applicants about their challenges and about what their rent costs are, and then make a more coherent recommendation next time, maybe.
As a minor point for recommendation number 3, it's VEA number.
Oh, sorry.
VEA number.
Thanks, Nikesh.
No problem.
Then I would ask if we have a motion to approve these 3 recommendations as written and to table recommendation number 4, I believe, to the next meeting.
So moved.
Does it need a second?
Oh, yeah, second.
Thank you. Can we get a vote, Dave?
Yes. Seat 8, Chair Jamalian, how do you vote?
Aye.
Okay. Seat 9, Aaron Flynn, how do you vote?
Aye.
Seat 10, Ryan McGilly, how do you vote?
Aye.
Seat 13, Nina Parks, how do you vote?
Aye.
Seat 14, Brendan Hollinan.
Aye.
And seat 15, Teresa Foglio Ramirez.
Aye.
And with that, the motion passes unanimously with 6 ayes, 0 nays, and 0 abstentions. Excuse me.
No one called
Thank
Sean.
you, David.
David, it looks like I'm thinking, if I know Member Richard's voice, that's Member Richard. So I believe Member Richard has joined us and should be reflected in the roll call as such. And because he's here, including him in the vote would be also a great idea.
Oh, great. Thank you, Nikesh, for catching that. Apologies, Sean. How do you vote on the motion on the floor for the adoption of the 3 recommendations as shared?
Aye.
Noted. Thank you, Sean. So the motion passes unanimously with 7 yeas.
Thank you, David. Hello, Sean. And that concludes agenda item number 6. Moving on to general public comment before we give the floor to the OOC for a quick staffing update.
Sure, thank you, Chair Jamalian. Regarding public comment for members of the public, please note that you have 2 options to provide public comment at this time. The first option is to call in by phone. You can do this by dialing 1-415-655-0001, followed by this access code 2489-809-0520, followed by *3 when prompted to do so. Option 2 is that you can submit comments by chat. The chat box is now open. I will read your comments as they come in. At this time, I don't see new comments, new from prior items. I also don't see new calls. Therefore, no public comments at this time.
Thank you, Jeremy. And the floor is yours, Nikesh.
Thank you, Chair Jamalian. I know at this point we've been going for about 3 hours and 5 minutes, so I will be as short and sweet as possible. I wanted to provide some updates about where the office is right now in terms of its staffing. There is some good news, there is some not so great news, and there is no way to actually break the not so great news. So I'll start there and then follow with the good news, because that is something genuinely to be excited about. But what I wanted to share with everyone who is listening, as well as the committee members, is that we will be losing a key member of the Office of Cannabis. Ray Law will be leaving, and it is with a heaviness, but also a deep sense of appreciation, respect, and happiness for Ray that I share that news. As many of you know, Ray is someone who operates behind the scenes. He's also very visible, but he is and he has been a pivotal part of why the office works so well. And what has been a joy for me as someone who's worked with him for the last 2.5 years, and for all of the members of the office who've worked with him in varying capacities, we have learned from him. We have benefited through the process of osmosis, and we feel that we are better off because of him. He will be leaving. He will not be going too far, and I will let Ray share the news of where he will be going. But as many of you know, Ray is not someone who draws himself to the limelight. So feel free to reach out by email if you want to contact him to get a sense of where he's going and also show your appreciation. But we will be losing Ray. A lot of what he has taught us will be staying with us. And that actually blends into the second update, which is the Office of Cannabis, as many of you know, is going through a process of growing. And that means that we have been in the process of interviewing and finalizing, soon to be, decisions around 3 new members who will be joining the office. This is very exciting for us because these will be 3 individuals who will be dedicated to permitting. As many of you know, that is a process that takes time. It goes through many different departments. And what we're really hoping for is, as these new members join us, they will help us improve our efficiency and the timelines that it takes. Now, again, many of you know that there's certain parts of this process that's within the OOC's wheelhouse, so that'll be under our control. We'll continue to work with our city partners to improve and expedite and troubleshoot where we see challenges to keep that process moving as well. But this is something we're really excited about. And with that will also come some restructuring. So what I would ask as we move forward into this next chapter, building upon all the good work of the OOC already, is patience, because before we can get better, we will have to build up, and that will be really important. And having the space, time, energy, and understanding of everyone in the community, and especially the committee, to support us is going to be sort of tantamount to how quickly we're actually able to do that. So I'm happy to answer any questions offline. Feel free to email me, but I did want to provide this update that the OOC is growing, but before it grows, we're also losing a pivotal member. Ray Law, I'm fairly confident I speak on behalf of everyone here, and definitely the Office of Cannabis, that we owe a debt of gratitude to you for standing up the office. I believe you were founding member number 2, and you came to the office when there was very little that was even conceptualized, and you have helped bring it to this point. So we're sad to lose you. We know that no one can replace you. We'll figure out a way to fill some of that gap, and I feel very confident that we'll be able to do that. We've benefited from Ray's experience, but we're also very excited for you, and we want to celebrate you as you take your next step. So with that, I want to conclude this meeting. If you have any questions for Ray, feel free to reach out to him directly. He will be transitioning out imminently, but he will be checking his email, and he'll be providing support to the OOC over the next couple of weeks, but his bandwidth will be more limited moving forward. So with that, not the happiest of notes, but I did want to be very transparent and also explain that reinforcements are coming. So much to look forward to, but much to also celebrate with Ray and his new beginnings. So thanks so much. And if you have any questions, just feel free to reach me offline.
Thank you, Nikesh. Thank you, OOC. And I think just the last statement is, if you look between the staffing issues at DBI planning and the OOC, go talk to your investors, go talk to people, and realign that expectation, because things are going to be a little bit slow in the next few months. That being said, thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.
Warriors.
Bye, everybody.